In the shadowed corners of history, where empires crumble and crowns turn to dust, lie stories that are not carved into monuments, but are instead whispered by the wind through the hollow halls of forgotten palaces. This is one such tale, etched in the cold, weeping stones of a kingdom long since erased from maps. It is the story of a throne built on blood, a love poisoned by ambition, and a legacy undone by a single, devastating secret. We journey back to a time of opulent misery to witness the unraveling of a royal line. A king, a queen, and a princess, bound together by fate and torn apart by the very power they sought to command. Here, in the ruins of their grandeur, we find no heroes, only ghosts. We find the echo of a promise that was never kept, a love that was never pure, and a silence that screams louder than any war cry. This is the chronicle of the Chamber of Forgotten Souls, a testament to the truth that even the most gilded cage is still a prison, and every throne is, in the end, a tomb. Before the marble halls and the silken banners, there was only mud, blood, and the unyielding will of one man. King Alaric was not born to rule. He tore his crown from the clutches of a dying dynasty. He was a warlord, a tempest in human form, whose charisma was as sharp as his blade. His early reign was a symphony of conquest, each victory raising the walls of his citadel higher, each defeated enemy paving the stones of his courtyard. He forged a kingdom from the embers of chaos, believing his strength was the only law that mattered. His subjects feared him, his soldiers revered him, and the nobility watched him with the coiled stillness of serpents. He saw affection as weakness and trust as a vulnerability to be exploited. His heart was a fortress, its gates barred even to himself. The king ruled from a throne of iron and fear, convinced that a legacy built with a sword could never be broken, unaware that the deepest fractures come not from without, but from the silent, creeping rot within. Into this brutalist world of steel and shadow stepped Queen Alara. Her arrival was a political necessity, a treaty sealed with a vow. She came from a land of art, poetry, and sunlight, a stark contrast to the grim austerity of her new home. She was a dove in a cage of hawks. On her wedding day, she moved through the court like a phantom, her gentle grace a silent rebuke to the cold ambition surrounding her. The king saw her as his most beautiful acquisition, a symbol of his power to command even beauty itself. He gave her jewels, gowns, and a palace, but never the key to his stone heart. The queen, in turn, learned to navigate the treacherous currents of the court with a quiet dignity that many mistook for fragility. She smiled when she was meant to smile, and she stood by the king's side as a perfect porcelain effigy of royalty. But in the solitude of her chambers, she would stare out at the unforgiving landscape, a silent prisoner of the crown she was forced to wear, her spirit slowly dimming like a candle in a sunless room. The birth of Princess Lyra was meant to be a symbol of unity, the dawn of a new, secure dynasty. The kingdom celebrated for weeks, with lavish feasts and grand tournaments meant to display the king's prosperity and might. But while the people cheered, a dark omen cloaked the palace. On the night of her birth, a violent, unseasonable storm raged, shattering the oldest stained glass window in the royal chapel, the one depicting the dynasty's founder. Whispers slithered through the court, speaking of a cursed bloodline. The king, however, saw only an heir, another piece on his grand chessboard, a daughter to be bartered for a powerful alliance. The queen, however, held the child and saw not a princess, but a life already ensnared by fate. She saw her own loneliness reflected in her daughter's innocent eyes. For Queen Alara, the princess was not a political tool, but a fragile soul she had brought into a world of shadows, a world she was desperate, yet powerless to protect her from. The celebration was a lie. It was a festival masking a shared, unspoken dread. The years that followed were a masterclass in silent decay. The initial splendor of the king's reign began to tarnish, like silver exposed to poison. The court was no longer a place of celebration, but a labyrinth of whispers, where loyalty was a currency traded for secrets. The king, consumed by the burdens of his conquests, grew increasingly paranoid. He saw assassins in every shadow and traitors in every friendly face. His once trusted advisor, a man named Valerius, watched the king's descent with cold, calculating eyes, his own ambition festering in the dark. The queen felt the chill of isolation deepen. Laughter would die in corridors as she approached, and conversations would halt, replaced by stiff, formal bows. She knew she was an outsider, a gilded ornament in a court that thrived on cruelty. The princess grew up amidst this cold war of glances and half-spoken truths, learning to read the language of silence before she could properly read books, sensing the tension that coiled beneath the palace's polished facade. The grand halls, once a symbol of the king's power, began to feel like a vast, echoing mausoleum. The king's ambition was a ravenous fire that could never be quenched. Having built his kingdom, he now sought to build an empire, a legacy that would dwarf the ancients. This hunger drove him to madness. He launched ill-fated campaigns in winter, sending thousands to their frozen graves. He levied impossible taxes on his people, turning their reverence into bitter resentment. The treasury, once overflowing with the spoils of war, was bled dry to fund his insatiable quest for glory. He ignored the counsel of his generals and the pleas of his queen, for his pride had become a wall between him and reality. The more his power became absolute, the more he craved. The king would spend his nights packing the battlements, staring into the darkness not as a protector, but as a predator, viewing neighboring lands as mere extensions of his will. His ambition was no longer about securing his kingdom. It was a desperate, feverish need to carve his name into the very fabric of the world, no matter if he had to tear it to shreds in the process. He was building a monument to himself, unaware he was using the bones of his own people for its foundation. Trapped within the cold embrace of her royal duties, Queen Alara waged a quiet, desperate war of her own. She saw the kingdom groaning under the weight of the king's obsession and the people's silent suffering. In secret, she would use her personal funds to distribute grain to starving villages and establish hidden infirmaries for the sick, small acts of defiance against her husband's tyrannical neglect. These acts, however, only deepened her isolation, marking her as a sympathizer in a court that rewarded ruthlessness. The king viewed her compassion as an insult to his strength, a woman's folly. He would mock her gentle nature in front of his council, further eroding her position and spirit. The queen found her only solace in the princess, pouring all her love and fear into the child. She taught her daughter the poetry and histories of her lost homeland, trying to plant a seed of light in a world consumed by darkness. But with every secret act of kindness, with every whispered story to the princess, the queen was weaving a web of secrets that would eventually become her own shroud. Princess Lyra blossomed into a beauty as melancholic as a winter rose. She possessed her mother's grace, but was burdened by her father's world. She lived a life of profound contradiction, dressed in the finest silks yet feeling the coarse fabric of fear against her skin every day. She was tutored in statecraft and diplomacy, yet the most valuable lessons she learned were from the hushed arguments she overheard through heavy oak doors. Her father, the king, saw her as his ultimate bargaining chip. Her hand in marriage was promised to the aging, cruel monarch of a neighboring empire to fund his next war. This alliance was to be the cornerstone of his legacy. The princess dreaded this fate, seeing it as an extension of her mother's gilded cage. She would wander the castle gardens, a lonely figure finding more companionship in wilting flowers than in the courtiers who offered her false smiles. Her destiny was not her own. It was a thread in her father's grand, bloody tapestry, and she could feel it pulling tighter around her throat with each passing day, choking the very life she so desperately wished to live. Every dynasty has a secret, a crack in its foundation hidden by tapestries and lies. This kingdom's secret was one that, if revealed, would not merely crack the foundation but shatter it into dust. Years ago, in the desolate loneliness of her early marriage, the queen had sought a moment of warmth, a brief respite from the king's cold cruelty. She had found it in the arms of a visiting diplomat from her homeland, a man who reminded her of the son she had left behind. From this fleeting, desperate union the princess was conceived. The king was not her father. This truth was the queen's most guarded possession, a secret she shared only with her most trusted handmaiden. But secrets in a palace of whispers have a way of seeping through the cracks. The handmaiden, under threat, confessed to Valerius, the king's ever-watchful adviser. He now held the key to the kingdom's undoing, a poison he could administer at the perfect moment. The queen lived in mortal terror, knowing the princess's very existence was a lie that could bring down the throne and condemn them all. Valerius did not wait long. With the kingdom weakened by famine and endless war and the nobility seething with resentment, he chose his moment. He revealed the queen's secret not to the king, but to the king's bitterest rivals within the court and the military. The revelation spread like wildfire, a justification for treason that the discontented lords had been waiting for. The king's bloodline was a fraud. The princess, the symbol of the future, was a lie. The claim to the throne was built on sand. An insurrection, meticulously planned in the shadows, erupted with shocking speed. The palace guards, their loyalty bought or broken, laid down their arms. The gates were thrown open, and the mob, led by ambitious nobles, stormed the halls. Tapestries were torn, treasures looted, and the sound of battle echoed through the once stately corridors. The king's iron-fisted rule, which he believed to be eternal, crumbled in a single night of fire and blood. The throne he had killed for was now just a chair in a burning room. In the heart of the chaos, the queen grabbed the princess, her only thought to escape the inferno that was her life. But their path was blocked not by the rebels, but by the king himself. His face was a mask of disbelief and pure, undiluted rage. Valerius, in a final act of cruelty, had made sure the king learned the truth just moments before his world collapsed. He looked at the queen, his wife of nearly 2 decades, and saw not the woman he had married, but the architect of his humiliation. He looked at the terrified princess and saw not a daughter but the living symbol of his failure. All his conquests, all his power, all his bloodshed had been for a lie. He raised his hand, the same hand that had held a scepter, and struck the queen. There, in the corridor flickering with the light of torches and smelling of smoke, the king's despair turned to monstrous violence. Her death was not swift. It was a brutal, agonizing end at the hands of the man she had been bound to. A final, terrible price for a single moment of stolen happiness. With the queen's life extinguished, something inside the king broke forever. The fire of his rage was replaced by a hollow, echoing emptiness. He did not even try to fight as the rebel soldiers seized him. They dragged the once mighty ruler, covered in his wife's blood, through the grand hall where foreign dignitaries once bowed to him. His crown was knocked from his head, clattering across the marble floor like a common piece of tin. Valerius, the new master of the kingdom, orchestrated a humiliating spectacle. The king was paraded through the city, pelted with refuse by the very people he had once ruled with absolute authority. His end came not on a battlefield, but in the filth of a public square. There was no glory, no final stand, only the pathetic whimper of a broken man haunted by the ghost of the woman he had murdered. His death was a grim footnote in the history he had tried so desperately to write for himself, a final testament to the fact that power built on cruelty inevitably consumes itself. Princess Lyra, who had witnessed her mother's murder and her father's capture, was the last remnant of the fallen dynasty. Her life was spared, not out of mercy, but out of a calculated cruelty. To the new regime, she was too powerful a symbol to kill, yet too dangerous to let free. She was the living embodiment of the old king's shame and the queen's betrayal. Her name was struck from all official records, her portraits burned. She was declared legally dead and taken to a remote, windswept monastery on the kingdom's northernmost coast. There, she was confined to a single, cold stone room high in a tower overlooking a furious sea. This room would become known by the locals as the Chamber of Forgotten Souls. She was no longer a princess. She was a ghost, left to live out her days with the phantoms of her past, her only companions the ceaseless crashing of the waves and the memory of her parents' tragic end. Her fate was a silence, a slow fading into the mists of legend, a story told to frighten children. The reign of Valerius was not the golden era he had promised. The kingdom, built on a foundation of lies and murder, remained cursed. The rot that had begun under the old king had seeped too deep into the soil. The lords who had helped him seize power now squabbled amongst themselves, carving the realm into feuding territories. The treasury was empty, the people were broken, and the land itself seemed to mourn, yielding bitter, meager harvests. The grand palace was left to decay, its charred halls and blood-stained floors a permanent monument to the tragedy that had unfolded there. The story of the ambitious king, the sorrowful queen, and the lost princess became a forbidden tale, a dark legend that parents whispered to their children as a warning against pride and secrecy. The kingdom did not heal. It fractured, withered, and was eventually swallowed by its more powerful neighbors, its name vanishing from the maps of the world just as the princesses had vanished from the royal records. All that remained was a ruin on a hill and the faint echo of sorrow. What is a kingdom but a collection of memories? And what happens when those memories are of betrayal and despair? The tale of this fallen family is a testament to the corrosive nature of power and the devastating weight of a single secret. The king sought immortality in stone and steel, but his legacy is written in blood and tears. The queen sought a moment of love in a loveless world and paid for it with everything she had. The princess, born of that forbidden love, inherited nothing but their sorrow, becoming a living ghost in her own story. Their grand palace now stands as a skeleton, a hollow carcass picked clean by time. But if you stand there when the wind is right, you can almost hear the whispers from the chamber of forgotten souls, a warning that thrones are not seats of power, but cages of glass, and that history does not remember the crowns, but the screams of those who wore them. History bleeds, and its echoes are written in the cries of kings, queens, and lost princesses. This was the Fear Room. Don't forget to subscribe and like for more dark history tales.